Welcome to this important lecture by Professor Sadam Issa entitled Picturing Atrocity, Visual Representations of ISIS in Arabic Political Cartoons. My name is Muhammad Khalil, and I'm the director of the Muslim Studies program here at Michigan State. I'd like to apologize. I cannot use my camera at this time, so you just hear my voice. But thankfully, you can see our guest speaker and his PowerPoint. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our various co-sponsors. In addition to the Muslim Studies program, the co-sponsors include the Asian Studies Center, Department of Political Science, Department of Linguistics and Germanic, Slavic, Asian, and African Languages. And that, of course, includes the Arabic program. Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, James Madison College, and Peace and Justice Studies. I'd also like to thank our administrative lead, Mary Ferdowsi, for setting up the webinar. And I'd like to thank Mary and also Naila Ahmed for helping us to get the word out. And now I'd like to turn my attention to our featured speaker. And I'd like to thank him for taking his time to be with us. Our featured speaker is Professor Sadam Issa. Professor Issa is an assistant professor of Arabic studies at the Arabic program at MSU. His research interests range from discourse analysis and sociolinguistics to research on anxiety in the classroom, hybrid teaching and learning, visual rhetoric, and lastly, political cartoons. He has published articles in a number of journals, including Al-Arabiya, Pragmatics and Society, Arabic Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Politeness Research, Popular Music and Society, the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, and Visual Studies. He's currently writing a book on Arabic political cartoons, and he's also a certified oral proficiency interview tester with full certification from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and is a beloved teacher of Arabic as well. And now I will turn it over to Professor Sadam Issa.
Thank you, Muhammad, and for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Mary, for organizing other logistic stuff. As Professor Muhammad mentioned that today's presentation is entitled Picturing Atrocity, Visual Representations of ISIS in Arabic Political Cartoons. Here is my presentation outline. The purpose of the study. We'll start with the purpose of the study, then move to literature review, method, analysis, discussion, and we will end up with questions and comments. And I truly appreciate your comments towards the end of my presentation, although the paper is published and you can view it online if you are interested, but I would definitely welcome comments and suggestions. As Professor Muhammad mentioned, I am currently working in my first book in Arabic political cartoons. Purpose of the study. This study analyzes how Arabic political cartoons portray the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, known as ISIS. In particular, the study examines how the metaphoric messages in a selection of political cartoons portray and situate ISIS terrorism within the Islamic world and distinguish ISIS victims from ISIS perpetrators of terror. The significance of the study. This study examines the role political cartoons rhetoric plays in relation to the political issue of terrorism and concomitant rise of Islamophobia. Knowledge gained from this study, therefore, has the potential to contribute to current debates on the subjects of terrorism, ISIS, and Islamophobia, and ideally to challenge perspectives that have conflated the Arab people and Islam with terrorism. In other words, the insights gained from this study can help set the record straight and establish that there exists in the Islamic world a very clear divide between ISIS terrorists and their victims, who share with the rest of the world the same abhorrence to ISIS terrorism. Hence, this study seeks to contribute to critical debates on terror and Islamophobia with a view to questioning the stereotypical images of the Muslim other and Oriental other that has unfairly stigmatized the Arab world. Research questions. What are the metaphorical strategies used in political cartoons to portray the concept of terrorism, and what are the functions of these portrayals? How do Arabic political cartoons function as an ideological weapon that helps fight internal extremism and illuminate the reality of ISIS terrorist practices? Literature review. Sam Keen has examined how the image of the enemy has been constructed in the history of political propaganda. He found that throughout history, the hostile imagination relies on dehumanizing the other. He provided the following archetypal images of the enemy as a stranger, aggressor, faceless, an enemy of God, barbarian, beast-like, and as death itself. Zena Masri followed Lakola and Mofis' lead in investigating the political posters that prevailed during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990. Masri argued that, beginning of quote, each political community's identity is equally the result of antagonistic relations taking place between the different communities that make the socio-political space of the Lebanese Civil War, end of quote. Political cartoons serve as a way of challenging and questioning dominant ways of thinking. Stromberg, for example, investigated how Arabs and Muslims are portrayed in comic books since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2011. Similarly, Rett found that Muslims and Middle Easterners are depicted in European popular culture as demonic, exotic, erotic, barbarous, money-grubbing, and double-dealing. Muller pointed out that the Danish Muslims felt that Danish political cartoons promoted fears and negative stereotypes toward their communities. To show the reality of Arab life and thus to disassociate Arabs and Muslims from terrorism, a Muslim community in Dearborn, Michigan appeared in a reality television show, All American Muslim. The endeavor, however, did not bear fruit as the reality show was later canceled. These examples do establish, however, that stereotypical images of Muslims and Arabs can reinforce a pervasive Islamophobia. There has been a steadily growing interest in understanding the role of visual cultures in our lives, largely because of the ongoing mass media exposure to violence and terror. Reflecting on the importance and power of images, Rushdie, for example, argued that, beginning of quote, it's possible that pictures of graphic violence still have power to make an impression, end of quote. In this study, I hypothesized that the cartoons surveyed in this study, likewise, beginning of quote, act as sites of hegemonic struggle, end of quote, and portray ISIS atrocities as uncivilized, barbaric, and treacherous actions. Methodology. A number of political cartoons selected for this study were retrieved from the newspaper and online archives and represent the work of Arab cartoonists who depict ISIS in their cartoons, like Ahmed Rahma, Ala al-Luqta, Jihad Orantani, and Imad Hajjaj. In order to ascertain whether political cartoons function as ideological and yet formidable weapons in the fight against ISIS extremism, I selected cartoons with visual or linguistic subject matter and themes that explore how opposition to ISIS is framed. In other words, I selected cartoons that have visual or linguistic mentioning of ISIS. To analyze the selected cartoons, I relied on methods and approaches related to semiotic morphisms, in particular blends, conceptual metaphor, and visual or pictorial metaphor. These concepts of metaphor, pictorial metaphor, and blending function as modes of signification, generating meanings, ways of generating meaning, ways of deciphering the meanings that the cartoons try to convey to the audience. Lakoff and Johnson developed what's called conceptual metaphor theory through their thesis that human thought is largely metaphorical in nature, and that this is expressed through language. They provided insight to the notion of metaphor as follows, beginning of quote, the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. Blending theory. Blending theory describes a set of principles for combining multiple spaces and frames connected by analogy and identity, mappings, giving rise to new mental spaces, or what they called blended spaces. An example of a blending, putting a face of a particular person on a body of an animal to dehumanize him or her. Pictorial metaphor theory. Benegro and Forcival show that visual metaphor is rooted in conceptual metaphors because of the strong verbal connections to pictorial and multimodal discourses. by multimodal discourses, I'm talking about the visual discourse and the linguistic discourse. As you know, political cartoons usually accompany linguistic text. So the resulting mapping will be entirely hinging on being able to interpret the visual discourse, which is the linguistic text, as well as the pictorial text, which is the image, obviously. They stated that pictorial metaphor consists of target and source that are exclusively or predominantly cued in the visual mode. They define target and source as follows. A metaphor consists of a topic or target and of a vehicle, a source, that to which the target is metaphorically compared. For Benigro and Percival, for example, in My Wife is a Moon, my wife is the target and moon is the source. If my wife is a moon is represented through visual information where readers can sufficiently cue the conceptual link between my wife, target, and moon, it's called pictorial or monomodal metaphor. In other words, if the message of the cartoon or if the cartoonist was able to convey his or her message by only relying on images, then we call this metaphor, obviously using a metaphor, we call this metaphor pictorial metaphor or monomodal metaphor. Monomodal metaphor because he or she used only one mode of signifying the metaphor. So Benigro and Percival argue that political cartoons may involve both the verbal and visual modalities in the construal of a metaphor. And in this case, the metaphor is multimodal metaphor. In other words, if the metaphor is conveyed by the image, as well as helped by the integration of a text, then the resulting metaphor will be multimodal, more than one mode. In this case, we call it multimodal metaphor. Forceful defines multimodal metaphors as metaphors in which target and source and or mappable features, which are the connotations, are represented or suggested by at least two different sign systems. And here talking about the visual sign or system and the language sign system. Another method that cartoonists rely heavily in their depictions of their own cartoons is the personification. Wales defines personification as a trope in which an inanimate object, animate, non-human, or abstract quality is given human attributes. Analysis. In this study, each cartoon, I analyzed each cartoon in 3 analytical steps, identifying what is referred to by the image, which is the denotation, the surface meaning, noting the pictorial metaphor it uses to determine what target and source domains should be mapped, and finally, how it construes the conceptual themes and messages in the cartoons that evoke opposition to ISIS atrocities. The following cartoon sheds light on the brutality of ISIS as a terror group and their effect on the Arab Spring that initially erupted in 2011 in Tunisia and spread into a number of Arabic countries. This cartoon sheds light on the brutality of ISIS, as I mentioned. The Arab word Daesh here is inscribed on the knife, and the tool of the crime here is written along with an arrow pointing towards the knife. Behind the knife here, a shade of a hand appears written on it, the Arab dictatorships. Here's the linguistic message reads, the Arabic dictatorships, referencing the dictatorships of the Arabic regimes. And here the linguistic message with the arrow hovering over the hand is called is translated into the criminal. Obviously, if you look at the knife here, this is the attire ISIS men used to wear when they appear in their videos executing their hostages. Underneath the knife, we have here a map of the Arab world. On it written the Arab Spring, and another word with the arrow pointing towards the Arab map, which can be translated into the victim. So here there is a number of visual metaphors and a blending. Let's start with the blending. Here the ISIS man is blended in a form of a knife. So that would result in the visual metaphor that ISIS man is a knife. And there is further linguistic integration here, which is the tool of the crime. So in other words, the cartoons try to say that ISIS uses knives as tool for their crime, which helped by the Arabic regime dictators. And the victim here is the Arabic Spring, which people were very helpful when it's erupted first. And obviously the Arab people. So in blending ISIS in the shape of a knife, the cartoon portrays ISIS as a killer, as the other. And using the map of the Arab countries to metaphorically reference the Arab populace under the threat of this killer, the cartoon visually depicts the Arab populace as victims of the other. Here, the cartoon relies on blending and metaphors. ISIS is a knife, a criminal. Arab regimes are criminals like ISIS, and the Arab populace are the victims. These visual tropes convey three messages. First, the Arab regimes help the emergence of ISIS. Second, ISIS is a terror group. Third, the Arab Spring and the Arab populations are victims of ISIS and the Arabic regimes. The extremism of ISIS was a consequence of the despotic Arabic leaders. It is believed that many leaders of ISIS have left their respective Arabic countries and helped establish ISIS as a result of the unjustness, corruption, and dictatorship of the Arabic regimes. Okay, so the second cartoon. This cartoon shows two ISIS men wearing their regular black attire, killing by knives two men wearing orange attire. The word ISIS is written in Arabic on the hand of the on the head of the ISIS man here. Daesh, which means ISIS. Okay. And then humanity and the human heritage are written on the two men with the orange attire. Here is a humanity, insaniya in Arabic, and the human heritage, okay, written on the other man. Okay. So the head of the man on the left of this cartoon is replaced with the head of a piece of ruins. In addition to executing their hostages and those who disobey their own Sharia, ISIS transcends their aggression to the cultural heritage, as you have seen in that cartoon. This cartoon refers to the shocking destruction of ruins in the Syrian city of Palmyra and in the Iraqi cities of Hatra and Nineveh by ISIS. ISIS destroyed ruins in these cities, claiming that these ruins depict human beings, something that runs against their own Sharia, and citing idol worship to justify their actions. This cartoon features a number of visual metaphors. ISIS men are killers. ISIS hostages are all of humanity, and ruins are shared human heritage. These metaphors are construed with the help of the linguistic text, a process that called by Ronald Barthes as anchorage. The textual anchorage in both multimodal metaphors help identify the source domains and thus adds extra information that's not communicated visually. In other words, if we want to rely on the image, we will not, for example, this one, we will not know that the cartoonist meant the human heritage. So the text or the text here or the linguistic text help us really know what the intention of the cartoon. And the next group of cartoons, we see how Arabic cartoons try to pinpoint the role of inside and outside actors. And here I mean the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, and ISIS, as well as Iran, as terrorists in terrorizing the Syrian people according to the cartoons. So this cartoon shows the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, who appears in military attire holding a cup full of blood. ISIS represented by a man wearing black attire with the word ISIS inscribed in his chest here. And Hezbollah, the word Hezbollah here is the word Hezbollah, okay? The word Hezbollah is written in green, which is their official color, and blended into the right hand of the ISIS man while holding a rifle painted in green. The word Hezbollah and the rifle would constitute Hezbollah's logo. Here, the cartoon uses blending, metaphor, and personification in mapping the connotations of this cartoon. Bashar al-Assad is a killer with a thirst for blood. The ISIS man is a killer. And Hezbollah is blended into the hand of the ISIS man and therefore is a killer like him. The cartoon also claims the Syrian regime and Hezbollah are collaborating with ISIS against Syria. This act would equate the Syrian regime and Hezbollah with ISIS as terrorist groups. It is known that since the start of the Syrian revolution in 2011, the Syrian president used all violent means to curb the revolt. Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran and Syria, has intervened after seeing the Syrian revolution threaten their existence in the southern of Lebanon. ISIS has taken advantage of the Syrian regime being busy curbing the revolution, especially after the revolution gained unprecedented progress and constituted a serious threat to the existence of the Syrian regime. It is said that the Syrian regime has facilitated the task for ISIS to occupy some parts of Syria for different purposes. First, to distract the attention of the international community from the causes of the Syrian revolution. Second, to delegitimize the Syrian revolution and show that the absence of the Syrian regime, quote unquote, will help terror groups such as that of ISIS to flourish and pervade, end of quote. In sum, through a number of visual personifications and blending, the cartoon depicts the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, an extension of Iran, and ISIS as terrorism trio that constitute a threat not only to the Syrian people, but to the whole globe. This depiction is further emphasized in the following cartoon as it shows a collaboration between the Syrian regime and ISIS in destroying Syria. So this cartoon is drawn by the Syrian cartoonist Saad Hajo. The cartoon portrays an image of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad wearing a suit with a tie blended into the colors of the Russian flag. Al-Assad is shaking a hand. The hand is in a black suit, written on it, the organization of the state. Here is the hand, the organization of the state, referencing ISIS in Arabic. This message is written by white color, and underneath this message, a circle in white is also drawn. The black and white juxtaposition visually references ISIS flag. In the speech balloon here, Al-Assad says to ISIS, "Thank you, we bothered you," in Arabic. In the background of the cartoon, there appears an image of the city of Palmyra that ISIS occupied from May 2015 until March 2016. The caption of the cartoon reads, "The Syrian regime retrieves the city of Palmyra from the organization of the state, handing and receiving it." It should be noted that the Russians sent troops to Syria on November 23, 2015, in an attempt to protect the Syrian regime from collapsing. The Russian government said that deploying troops in Syria aims at fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups in Syria, referencing the Syrian rebels who revolted against al-Assad by the advent of the Syrian revolution. This cartoon counters this statement by arguing that the Syrian regime, Russia, and ISIS are collaborating against the Syrian people. After months of a devastating occupation, including the destruction of the city's ruins, raping women, killing men and children, needless to say, the various forms of torture exercised by ISIS on the people of Palmyra, the Syrian regime recaptured the city on March 27, 2016. It is said that the Syrian regime facilitated the occupation of the Palmyra by ISIS. This idea is reinforced by the linguistic text handing, which denotes handing willingly the city of Palmyra to ISIS. This linguistic message is written in red color, which intended to heighten the danger of this act by the Syrian regime. So the Syrian regime uses ISIS as a tool to achieve different political goals. First, the Syrian regime tries to distract the international community's attention from the atrocities they perform on the Syrian people on a daily basis. Second, the Syrian regime uses ISIS as a tool to kill the Syrian people in retaliation to the Syrian revolution that delegitimized its right to rule Syria. Third, and this is the message of the cartoon, the Syrian regime wants to show the world that it's fighting ISIS, terrorism, and that they are the only side that can defeat ISIS. This political maneuver aims at legitimizing the continued existence of the Syrian regime. It could also be looked as a way for the Syrian regime to buy more time before it reaches its end. Another actor that collaborates with the Syrian regime and ISIS against the Syrian people is Iran, as the following cartoon shows. Iran has been probably the biggest supporter for Hezbollah and the Syrian regime, especially after the eruption of the Syrian revolution in 2011. This cartoon uses personification and blending as a means to communicate its messages. The cartoon shows the Iranian supreme leader Ali al-Khomeini, who is the head of the state and the highest ranking political and religious authority in the Islamic Republic of Iran, holding a rifle. The rifle is blended into the image of an ISIS man. It is said that ISIS has aims that go well beyond a separatist agenda. It seeks the annihilation of Shiites and the establishment of an Islamic State in accordance with the fundamentalist reading of Sharia law. Despite this statement that indicates ISIS' stance against Iran and the Shia, the cartoon shows the involvement of Iran in flourishing ISIS. The cartoon also shows the collaboration of Iran and ISIS against the Syrian people. So another theme the survey cartoons try to communicate is criticizing the Arab leadership and the international coalition position in dealing with ISIS. The following cartoon tries to criticize the Arabic leadership. This cartoon shows three men. The one on the right side of the cartoon holds a sign that reads "War on the Infidels," this guy. The word ISIS is written on his turban right here. The man in the middle, metaphorically representing the Arab populace, okay, wears Arabic kufiya, the white one, and cries heavily. The man on the left wears military clothes, metaphorically represents the Arabic leaders, okay? On his kufiya, a skull replaces what should be a crown here. The crown symbolizes power, glory, immortality, royalty, and sovereignty, while the skull connotes death, danger, and dictatorship, the dictatorship of the Arabic leaders. The military man holds a sign that reads "The War on Terrorism," right here in Arabic. The Arab man in the middle has both hands bitten by the ISIS man and the Arabic leader. This cartoon reflects on the calamity of the Arabic population who suffer from the brutal practices of ISIS, who look at the Arab populace as infidels and the dictatorship of the Arabic leaders. It is noticed that the Arab man who represents the Arab populace wears a brown sweater. The brown color matches the background of the placard on which the war in terror is written. The goal of this color matching is mapping the connotative message, the war in terror, into the Arab man, the Arab populace, as being terrorists, but sarcastically. ISIS looks at those who don't follow their Sharia as infidels and will receive the had, Islamic punishment. ISIS had is usually death. They follow different means of killing, ranging from execution by sword and knife to burning, as what happened to the Jordanian pilot Mu'adh al-Kasasbi in early January 2015, to stoning sinners, to throwing them from high buildings, to drowning them in water. So this cartoon uses a number of blendings in transmitting its messages. The cartoon shows a woman with her hands tied behind her back between a hammer and an anvil. Okay, the woman sheds bloody tears right here. Maybe it's bloody tears. The word Syria is written on the woman right here. The organization of the state here is written on the anvil, referencing ISIS, as well as Daesh are written on the anvil. Both the organization of the state, referencing the quote unquote the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and Daesh, which is another word for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The anvil is blended into the flag of ISIS. The phrase barrel bombs are written on the hammer. So here is the hammer. It's called the bombing barrels that the Syrian regime used against the the Assyrian people. Both the hammer and the anvil are painted in black and white. The linguistic texts inscribed on them are drawn in white to match the colors of ISIS flag. The cartoon uses the black color in painting both the explosive barrel used by the Syrian regime against the Syrian people and the anvil, which is blended into the flag of ISIS to emphasize the death that both ISIS and the Syrian regime brought to the Syrian people. The cartoon also depicts a hand that holds a hammer with the word the opposition front right here, referencing the Iranian and the Syrian regimes written on it. This cartoon uses an image of a Syrian woman symbolizing the Syrian nation, weak and under threat, to arouse the emotions of the audience, picturing the Syrian nation under threat by both ISIS, a terror organization, and the Syrian regime, a tyrant regime, evokes the audience's emotion wish to protect and preserve her honor. Doing otherwise would make the audience subject to criticism according to Arabic culture. Here, many studies that investigated the role of the female figure in constructing nations found that nation is frequently represented as a woman under threat of violation and dominations. Such a depiction arouses emotions among its members who should sacrifice for her safety and for her honor. Similarly, the following cartoon depicts this cartoon depicts the Arabic Spring in Syria as a feeble woman under threat of ISIS and the Arab leaderships and the Syrian regime barrel bombs. So the last cartoon I'm using in my presentation, I would like to invite some participants to help, decipher the messages intended by this cartoon. I definitely can help, translating the linguistic messages. Here it says the Muslim youth, and this the extreme interpretation of Islam written in here. Obviously, we have books here. So, and here written interpretation of the book, referencing the Quran, obviously. So anybody wants to help interpret this cartoon using the visual metaphor, his or her understanding of this metaphor in accordance to what I have talked about in terms of theory, in terms of interpretations, in terms of context. Adnan Abbasi, can you allow him, Professor Muhammad? Or Mary? Can you allow Adnan? Go ahead.
I was going to ask if Mary could do that. Unfortunately, I'm not able to.
Go ahead, Adnan.
Yes, he can do it now.
Hello. So yeah, it's morning here in India. I'm not sure about, it's 3 a.m. in India. I'm from India, so I'm not sure about US. So good morning. So this image, I don't know how to read Arabic, but as you said, the translations. So if we see the expression of the person looks very engaged, and while he is reading, but we can also see kind of a snake here, and there's a tongue coming. Maybe it's saying that the person is actually reading, absorbing some venom, right? And then maybe the person is becoming extremist by reading this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Everything you said is totally correct. You're right. He's totally engaged, and this is represents the Muslim youth that ISIS helped recruited. You're right. This is a snake. What do we call this technique? So this is a snake, and here the linguistic message in Arabic reads interpretation of the kitab, because the Quran, we can't really understand only the Quran from what it says. We have to refer to the interpretation. There are generic rules about Islam that are not interpreted in details in the Quran. So there are books that interpreted these Quranic verses as well as prophetic sayings. So who can tell me what technique that the cartoonist used? We have a snake, we have interpretation of the book, which is the books that are composed to interpret the Quranic verses. Adnan, you are absolutely welcome to participate if you want, since you are already there.
Actually, I am not sure about the technique, so yeah, I'd rather
Okay.
pass.
Okay, maybe Harnoor. But thank you, Adnan. I appreciate your participation.
Yeah, hi. I think it's kind of a visual metaphor because it's trying to say that extremist views are like as poisonous as venom to society. So I look at it as like a visual metaphor.
Okay, cool. Interesting. Obviously, yes, it's a visual metaphor. I will come to it, but there's another technique. Anybody else before Philip? Philip?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
It's blending.
Yes, blending. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you. And thanks to Harnoor. So here what I'm going to say about this cartoon. This cartoon shows a young man wearing a dash Islamic traditional clothing and reading from a book that is blended into a head of a snake. The extreme interpretation of Islam is inscribed on the body of the snake here. The Muslim youth is written in the background of the cartoon with an arrow pointing toward the young man. He and the snake are surrounded by 3 books. Here, the linguistic text help the readers interpret the messages of the cartoon, without which the meanings might be rendered ambiguous. In other words, the linguistic text orientate the readers towards a particular message, and that's what Ronald Barthes called anchorage. In this cartoon, I argue that it articulates political and cultural mythologies to undermine the legitimacy of ISIS practices, which are deceptively linked to Islam, and thus reveals the real picture behind them. Yes. So the message of this cartoon this cartoon tries to communicate is that ISIS and its practices pose a threat to young Arabs and Muslims. Alessandria Massey indicated that ISIS implements harsh interpretation of Sharia law. Through this harsh interpretation of Sharia law, ISIS constructed a religious justification to kill men and enslave women and children. This cartoon tries to alienate ISIS and its distorted interpretation of Sharia by dehumanizing it in an image of a snake. The dehumanization occurs using the strategies of metaphor, as I think Harnoor mentioned, and blending, and that's what's called homosexuality. It's a combination of visual metaphor and blending. And when the visual metaphor and blending get together, we call it homosexuality, according to Carroll, 1996. This dehumanization aims at othering ISIS and depicting them as a hostile foe. Here, Sam Keen, 1991, found that throughout history, the hostile imagination relies on dehumanizing the other. This dehumanization also aims at disparaging ISIS, delegitimizing ISIS practices. Kurtz, 1997, stated that homosexuality can then function, among other things, as a medium to transfer moral messages, which what happens in this cartoon, demoralizing ISIS. Further, the cartoon manipulates colors to convey the above message. The green color traditionally symbolizes life. However, ISIS distorted Sharia depicted in a green snake changes the signification of the green color into annihilation one, as what ISIS did with the recruited Arab youth. Discussion. Early on, we asked, what are the metaphorical strategies used in political cartoons to portray the concept of terrorism, and how do they function? Our findings suggest that the metaphor and blending constitute a visual narrative, that the assertion of Gombrich about political cartoons holds true. Metaphor is a common unexpected device in political cartoons. It is the main weapon in the cartoonist armory. This structural approach to metaphor and blending deepens our understanding and appreciation of how political cartoons portray political conflicts by employing unmistakable messages. For example, ISIS as a snake, standing for the complex concept of ISIS as a threat and danger to the religion and youth of Islam. The images employed also use individuals to stand for groups or countries. Examples include the images of a woman defeated in body and soul stand for Syria and implicitly all Arab countries terrorized by ISIS. Arab political cartoons tell us much about ISIS and how its practices are discussed in Islamic politics. The cartoon portrayals of ISIS as a terrorist organization is intended to the gravity of the threat that ISIS poses to Arabs and Muslims. In depicting this threat, cartoons imbue ISIS with the pictorial conventions used to portray Oriental others. ISIS is characterized as murderous and snakes. In What Do Pictures Want by W.G.T. Mitchell states that caricature takes the stereotype and deforms or disfigures it, exaggerating some features, okay, rendering the figure of the other in terms of some subhuman object in order to ridicule and humiliate. In depicting the terrorist group as a deadly snake fused with a holy book, the cartoon helps convey feelings against ISIS and its ideology as a force that seeks to justify its barbarism with a blatant misinterpretation of Sharia law. Political cartoons such as this one, juxtaposing the seemingly calm setting of a boy at prayer with the sinister intrusion of a venomous snake fused into his prayer book, are full frontal attacks on ISIS, accusing it of callous deception. And as such, these depictions serve to mitigate more Islamophobic perceptions common in the Western media. These political cartoons are attempts to set the record straight and establish that Islam is not a religion of terror. These cartoons steer the emotions of the audience by depicting ISIS terror and fostering identifications with those victimized by an enemy. The cartoons depict ISIS as evil and young Muslims, ISIS main recruitment target, as innocent victims. Such depictions show that Muslims are also victims of ISIS, and so constitutes a challenge to Islamophobia, which paradoxically it does by deploying visual stereotypes to challenge the myths that the West entertains about Oriental others. The political cartoons discussed in this presentation are effective because they illuminate how Arab majority views ISIS. In an article entitled How to Fight ISIS with Cartoons, Casual states that editorial cartoonists are typically the most influential voices in newspapers throughout the Middle East, reflecting the views of their readers. Following Casual, I argue that political cartoons in this study that picture the concrete effects of ISIS atrocities are best seen as soldiers deployed to fight an intellectual war against ISIS radical ideology and its extreme interpretations of Sharia law. In conclusion, this paper demonstrates that the political cartoons under discussion rely on a discourse of terror and a physical violence and challenges ISIS' claim that its ideology and practices are grounded in Islamic beliefs. Sam Keen asserts that we should take political humor, in particular editorial cartoons, as revelations of the mythic assumptions as a society makes about itself. In this sense, these political cartoons are building a consensus about a moral order that is unconditionally undermining the mythic assumptions that ISIS makes about itself by claiming that their brutal actions are in accord with Islam. The surveyed cartoons represent ISIS as others and as an enemy within. This representation disseminates visual antagonistic messages towards the others that help shape public opinion. This antagonism is shaped because of the others' repressive and ideological apparatus against not only Westerners and human heritage, but also against Arabs and Muslims. Thank you. The floor is yours for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Issa, for a very interesting presentation. And now we will open the floor for questions. So we will ask that people type in their questions in the Q&A. If you're on a laptop, you'll notice it usually at the bottom. If you're on a smartphone, you'll notice if you press on the screen, you'll notice a little Q&A box at the top there. We actually already have a question. And this one comes from Deborah Margolis of MSU Libraries. And I believe this is in regard to the snake image. The question is, what about green as an Islamic color, the religion here distorted by ISIS?
Well, thank you for the question. I think I did mention that, I believe, but well, in principle, the green color is a very positive color in the Arabic culture, and I believe in many cultures as well. It denotes a purity in Islam and in the Arabic culture. But here, ISIS distorted that image, the image of a purity, okay? And the cartoon shows visually this distortion by blending the holy book, which is okay, or the interpretation of the holy book into an image of a snake. So transferring the negative attributes and features of a snake into their own interpretation of Sharia. So it became negative now.
Thank you for that. I wonder if you could, while we're waiting for the next question, if you would comment on an article that came out in The Atlantic a few years ago that generated a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion. It was an article by Graham Wood, and it was called What ISIS Really Wants. And in the article, Graham Wood says ISIS is Islamic, period, very Islamic. And I think this was a widespread perception. And I think your study is interesting in that it shows a very different perspective. I wonder if you might comment on that widespread perception. You did already a little bit, but I wonder if you might say a bit more.
Okay, so thank you for the question. So when did I decide to write this paper? Before using particular cartoons as a tool to communicate to the world the reality of ISIS, or I said, and in my paper I said the real picture of ISIS. I was in DC and I received a call from my wife after I just landed and told me that the Jordanian pilot Mu'adh al-Kasasbi was burned by ISIS. He was captured by ISIS, and eventually ISIS released a video showing, that ugly video burning Mu'adh al-Kasasbi, the Jordanian pilot. At that time, that I decided I should do something. As an academician and my interest in political cartoons, eventually the idea evolved, and I decided to show the real picture of ISIS. Now, there is another theory in political cartoons, which is very much related, which is that political cartoons, or the ideas depicted in political cartoons, represent the public. So I want to show the West, and those like the writer of that article in The Atlantic, I want to show them the real picture of ISIS. I want to show them how the public, the Arabic public, view ISIS. So I decided to obviously write this paper, which actually, this is not only the ideas or opinions of the cartoonists. These are the ideas and the opinions of the great majority of the Arab public. Okay, so which shows this association with ISIS, which shows that they view ISIS as a terrorist group, which shows that ISIS interpretation of Islam is totally distorted. Okay, so, but that's a visual, okay, evidence. One of the importance, one of the significances of using political cartoons as a tool in revealing political realities, just such as this one, political cartoons are not censored. I mean, they are censored when it comes to criticizing the Arabic leaderships, okay? But these cartoons were not censored, okay? Unlike maybe like books, okay? And books also could, there are some details that could be glossed over in textbooks. But political cartoons capture these, what I call miniature, like small details. And they are not censored, obviously, and also reflect the public. So I found that political cartoons really are very, authentic and, honest, straightforward medium to show the atrocity. I called my paper Picturing Atrocity. Okay, yes. And it does represent, the content of this paper and the content of these cartoons, surveyed cartoons, represent how the Arab public view ISIS, as you have seen in my, analyzed cartoons.
Yes, thank you for that. The next question comes from Andrew Joseph. In your work, have you found that cartoonists in the Arab world use certain linguistic tools more so than cartoonists in the West or elsewhere?
Okay, so obviously I'm more into the Arabic political cartoons. I do, follow, but not really, many Western cartoons. But one general observation, obviously it needs to be verified. I feel like that the Western cartoonists rely heavily on integrating linguistic text into their cartoons. So many cartoons, you see linguistic text accompanied their cartoons. In the Arab world, there is sort of a tendency to using linguistic text, but they tend to be short, okay? They tend to be short. There's nothing really special about the linguistic text as far as Arabic cartoonists are concerned. But maybe something else, another technique that is interesting maybe to note, which is the use of personification. The Arab cartoonists don't use personifications in depicting the Arabic leaderships. They don't use the real picture of a particular president, because obviously she will be sent to the prison, simply. But they use, like, as you've seen in the cartoon criticizing the Arabic leadership, a man with a military attire wearing a headscarf that represents, obviously, with the skull and his kufiya, that represents the Arabic leaderships. But the image does not represent a particular Arabic president.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to encourage folks to type in their questions in the Q&A. We still have time for a question or two. While we're waiting, I wonder, when we think about ISIS, we don't hear about ISIS as much as we used to, let's say 3 years ago. And I wonder, with regard to political cartoons, to what extent do you find ISIS in more recent publications?
You know what? That's a good question. ISIS doesn't have that impact that it used to have, let's say, 3 years ago. Even in media, like when I follow Arabic media, they rarely mention ISIS. So ISIS is shrinking and almost not there. There's some, I'm not saying they're not there, but there's some, but they don't have that, capacity that they used to have. I think there are two reasons for that. First of all, the situation in Iraq is more stable than before, okay? Because they started in Iraq, as you all know. Then it spread to Syria. The revolutions in Syria and later on the civil war, helped ISIS to occupy some good land in Syria with the help of the Syrian regime, as the cartoons showed. But eventually, after the Syrian regime, got a better grip on the Syrian revolution, and obviously they sort of fought against ISIS and forced them to, withdraw from good land, from certain lands in Syria. So ISIS almost is not there, and therefore, I don't remember. I've seen maybe really only probably a couple of cartoons over the past 3 years depicting ISIS. Okay, but there are hotter topics that Arabic cartoons, are depicting. Obviously, right now the coronavirus, but other hot topics like, for example, include former presidents' political decisions to move Jerusalem or the American embassy to Jerusalem, and then what's called his peace plan, famously known as the deal of the century. So these are hot topics, obviously, that you see depictions of a lot, over the past 2 years or 3 years since the former president has announced them, but rarely see cartoons in ISIS right now.
Yes, thank you. We have here a question from Grant Carey. You discussed how political cartoons represent the opinions and ideals of the general public. I was curious if you have studied the extent to which political cartoons shape or alter public opinion.
Okay, that's really a good question. This study obviously requires, massive interviews with the public to figure out how a particular sets of cartoons have altered their opinion or shaped their opinion in a way or another, or obviously disseminating surveys and so on and so forth. Because I live in the States, it's really hard to travel and to do such a study, but it's worth investigating, in my opinion. And I think I should do that because it's very important to see the extent. That would lead us to really a very concrete evidence of the impact of political cartoons, on people. But obviously, it requires lots of work in terms of traveling, finding, obviously, a group of people who have exposed to certain groups of cartoons and measuring their opinion before seeing the cartoons and their opinion after they've seen the cartoons. But I think it's worth investigating. It's a good idea. I'll definitely put it in my list, to be investigated in the future.
Yes, thank you. Next, we have a question from Professor Ani Sarkisian. I find it interesting that you said Arab leaders are not depicted, yet the Syrian and Iranian ones were in the cartoons you showed. Why are they not off limits?
I'll tell you why. Because, for example, Saad Hajo, the Syrian cartoonist who clearly criticized Bashar al-Assad in a personification method, he is not living in Syria, so there is no threat. Second of all, even the Arabic, almost every Arabic leaders showed opposition to the Syrian regime and to what he did towards his people. So cartoons from those countries will not fear being, taken to the prison, right? And they're not traveling to Syria. And there were lots of hope that the Syrian regime will collapse, in 2014-15. So they did not care about depicting ISIS or Hezbollah or Iran, obviously, in a personification. But obviously, if they have depicted, let's say, their Arabic leaders, I don't think even the cartoon will last more than a couple of minutes in Facebook if they have published on Facebook, because the intelligence device and the security will definitely invade his office or her office or his house or her house. So this is why it was safe, in other words, for those Arabic cartoons to depict Bashar al-Assad or the Iranian supreme leader or Hezbollah, but not safe to depict their own Arabic leaders.
Thank you for that. And this will have to be the final question. This is from Lynn Wolf. Can you say more about the context of where these cartoons appear, print or online, and in which types of publications?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, these cartoons appear in Facebook. Every cartoonist has his own platform in Facebook, as well as a Twitter. I am not in Twitter, quite honestly, but I am in Facebook. So, and all of these cartoonists are my friends in Facebook. So I see their publications on a daily basis. So I collect them basically from their Facebook pages. Obviously, I'm also in touch with them. I did some interviews with them, and obviously I asked them to send me cartoons that they didn't publish, or I myself, for some reason, couldn't see that where they depicted ISIS. So they sent me their cartoons. So Twitter, Facebook, they are published in some newspapers. Some of these newspapers are located in London. Like, for example, Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Al-Quds Al-Arabi, that's a very famous journal in London. The Arabic Jerusalem, that's the literal translation of the Arabic newspaper. They publish there a lot. And there, obviously, they publish their cartoons in their respective countries' newspapers. Obviously, as long as these cartoons don't, criticize the Arabic regimes, otherwise they will not be published. But since they're depicting ISIS, the Arabic, obviously, newspapers will allow them to do that.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to end here because it looks like we're having some interesting comments in the Q&A. So thank you, Professor Sadam Issa, for an excellent presentation. And we will conclude. I'd like to ask Mary to end the session right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.